You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Today, we are presenting to you a special program on China-U.S. relations as the bilateral trade negotiations continue this week in Beijing. William Cohen, the former U.S. Defense Secretary, a Republican who served in the Clinton administration, knows well that when the strong pillar of economic and trade ties are threatened, the overall relationship usually becomes unpredictable. During his annual interview with me at the China Development Forum, he articulated that well and the importance of leadership and follow through for both sides once the trade negotiations are done. The security situation between China and the United States used to be an unstabilizing factor. But now with trade and economic ties in question, many wonder whether it would play a more constructive role now in the bilateral relations.
Well, I think business ties are critically important to maintaining stability between our two countries. That has tended to fray over the past 10 years. The business community has not been as strong as they have been in the past in advocating this strong relationship between the U.S. and China. So when the pillars of economic stability are not there in cooperation, then the security issues tend to override that. And so once we have an agreement, if we do have an agreement, I think that can be a stabilizing force, but it will not resolve the security issues per se. And so that's going to be a separate negotiation, separate discussions. But I think without the underpinning of the business community, the security issues will dominate and disrupt the relationship.
Right. Mr. Secretary, now China has been making efforts since last year trying to put the bilateral relations back on track since the so-called trade war broke out. For example, financial sectors, there have been quite a number of liberalizing measures. Right. Recently, the foreign investment law, many question what the U.S. has done.
Well, the U.S. Has not made any changes in our law per se. What the U.S. has said that we would like to see a number of the changes in how the Chinese apply their laws to U.S. and Western companies. So it's been a wait and see on the part of the United States to see whether or not there'll be any changes in terms of forced technology transfer, whether there'll be any changes in terms of the taking of intellectual property or the transfer of intellectual property, the forced transfer. If the West and the United States see that, then I think there will be a positive relationship.
But there's also the issue of credibility, as we can see that some heads of state just walk away sometimes from negotiations. And we witnessed that in Hanoi, for example. Well, one could argue whoever is the one that's walk away, but there is an issue like that. So how credible if there is an agreement reached between two sides?
Well, there shouldn't be an agreement reached unless both sides remain committed to seeing that it's enforced. In other words, just to have a superficial signing of an agreement with no real intellectual and moral commitment to abide by its terms is really not very productive. So I think it's important that we get the terms right, that we understand that we're committed to the effective enforcement and commitment to abide by the terms. Then I think the agreement will make sense. Without it, it's just an agreement on the surface and not very productive.
But of course, people are also arguing that whether there has been some kinds of consensus within the U.S. system that there will be tough approach to China no matter what the result of the negotiation would be. So if that were the case, it's very worrying.
Well, leadership comes from the top. If the President of the United States does not take the lead in saying this is a good deal for the United States, then those below him may take issue and then try to undermine the agreement. But he has to be very forceful in saying this is right for the American people. And of course, President Xi has to say this is good for the Chinese people. Yeah. But without that leadership from the top, then the bureaucratic infighting takes place. Congress then starts to get involved in saying we don't like the agreement. And so I think if the President takes the leadership on this, we'll follow through.
We have seen ups and downs in the bilateral relations, but we are all on a learning curve as to how to deal with one another. When China is to what it is today, while U.S. is dealing with its internal challenges.
Right.
What do you think are the biggest learning curves that the two sides have to bear in mind for each other?
Well, basically, we still have an element of distrust. The Chinese distrust the United States in terms of its, quote, credibility to keep its word, not walk away. The U.S. Has distrust on the Chinese side that you say all of these things, but then you don't follow through with action. So basically it's saying, let's get back to trusting each other in word, but also in deeds, so that we look at the action that follows the words that are given, and then if we see there's action to follow up the words, then you start rebuilding the trust that was there in years past that has not been there recently.
For both sides?
For both sides. It's in our interest to stay engaged, not to walk away, to sit down and make sure we do our level best to remove all of the obstacles, if we can, understanding. There are always going to be tensions between us. There are always going to be obstacles to overcome. But the only way that is the safe way, responsible way, is to sit at the table and work it out.